One person who I should have mentioned in chapter 12, I forgot outright, is Pope Gregory the Great. I believe I mentioned him once in connection with the Julian calendar, but Pope Gregory set up the calendar that we still use as of 2014. The calendar is expected to not need any adjustments for 10,000 years. It's a calendar that has leap years. Every fourth year is a leap year, except for years like 1700, 1800, and 1900. Those years were not leap years. But the year 2000 was. 2100, for those of you who might live that long, will not be a leap year. The idea is to keep the equinoxes and solstices occurring approximately the same day, to where that these summers will still be hot. I mean, July and August will still be the summer months, and December and January will still be the winter months. If Gregory had not made that change, right now we'd probably be in the hot part of the year, but still calling it December. But it would, I mean, actually this would be July, in other words, and it'd be cold months of the year, but it would be July if Gregory hadn't made that change. Now, about Pope Gregory, he's about the only pope that's called the Great. Of more than 300 popes the church has had, it has been said, and folk, I read this in one of the most anti-Catholic books you can read, but this author said if all the popes had been as good as Gregory the Great was, there would have been no Protestant Reformation. All of Europe would still be Catholic, and possibly all of this part of the world might still be Catholic also. He was an outstandingly good man. In fact, another book I read about the popes, written by Roman Catholics, said there were two popes that deserved the title of the Great. This one and Pope John the 23rd, who was Pope from 1959 to 1963, Pope when I was a child. Those two. Anyway, somehow I neglected to mention him until now. All right. Someone asked about the final exam, so I looked at it this morning. 78 questions for both classes. So again, you will not be answering the same questions they do. It's either multiple choice, true, false, or matching. There's several matching questions and some true, false. Half of it will cover these last two chapters. I used to give as separate tests for chapters 11 and 12. I give 5 tests of chapter 11, probably chapter 12 and 13 being the test on the last, being given on the last day of class. But then I quit that and decided I'd just have another lecture day and combine the final with a test on chapters 12 and 13. So half of it, chapter 12 and 13. The other half will go all the way back to Paleolithic times, Neolithic times, Sumerian, Egyptian, Babylonian, those time periods. Know a little bit about the Greek history, about Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pericles. Some of you wrote papers on some of those philosophers. Again, be concerned about it, but let me remind you, folk, on a multiple choice test, you're probably going to make the same grade on the final that you made that your average is throughout the semester. Most of the time you do. If you ever learned it once, it'll come back to you in a multiple choice test. Now that's not necessarily true in a fill in the blank, at least not for me. To each his own. I always liked multiple choice tests because I have a tendency in mind to go blank when I see a fill in the blank test, and I know the name of the it begins with an M, or it begins with an N, I think, but I've had that problem all my life, and still do. But anyway, multiple choice, if I see it, I'll recognize it. All right. Again, about the issue of study guides, the only study guide I have, and you probably would not want to see, it consists of about 130 pages, comprehensive. And I made it up several years ago. There's some things in it that's no longer in the book, some things in it I no longer teach. And I looked at it this morning, and one thing in it that I'm about to teach today is absolutely wrong. And I don't feel like I have time to correct it. But I learn as I go along too, the same way hopefully that you do. All right, any other questions? Yeah.
What is the test going to be consist of?
What is what?
The test, what does it mean the questions are going to consist of from, like chapters 12?
Chapters 12 and 13, that means that there'll be about 30 to 40 questions from chapters 12 and 13. Actually, about 40 from chapters 12 and 13, and about 40 from the other chapters.
So it's
chapters 1 through 11.
questions.
What's that?
So it's going to be 80 questions?
78 questions.
78.
78. Unless the department puts 20 more on me like they have done before. They've often dropped 20 questions on me, which I'm expected to answer. And that would make 98.
And it's what, December 3rd?
Final exam for this class is December 3rd at this time of day, except I have 2 hours instead of just 75 minutes, 120 minutes. There's one student in my other class who's still registered and comes occasionally, has not taken one test or one, that's not the way I entered that course. Not one test or not one of the other quizzes I was required to give either. Pass. Yeah, again, my mind went blank. And not one pass. And, you know, I was just saying, hey, he can either come on the final and make all of them up at once, I'll grade him, or he can take a 0 for the course. Of course, this student hasn't turned in a paper yet either, so I'm going to wind up with a 0. And something else, folks, now we run into this all the time. I have in another class 2 A+ students. One of them dropped the course. The other one quit coming to class and gave me no explanation. I mean, again, to each his or her own, maybe they're really, really badly sick. I don't know what the problem is. But it's almost a shame because they both had A's pretty well sewed up for the course. And, well, like I say, the one dropped. But this, you know, I don't get used to it. I'm not going to say I get used to it, but it's something you have to contend with. All right, any other questions? Now, I knew that the attendance would be somewhat slack today. I mean, I'm not surprised, but nevertheless, I'm going to try to make it worth your while to have a pretty good class. All right, moving on. I think I mentioned this. Pogrom, that is in your book in big black print, it simply means an attack against Jews. And I mentioned how that particularly during the Black Death, the Jews did not seem to catch it as much as other people, and this made the Europeans very, very angry at them, and they accused them of witchcraft. So they tended to drive them out. The kings of this part of Europe, Western Europe, tended to drive them to the east. So they moved east, and what this wound up doing in the long run was setting them up for the Holocaust that came later. They wound up settling in Russia. Now you might say, I didn't know Russia had a Holocaust. No, Russia didn't. But when the Germans invaded Russia, they rounded up every Jew they could because the Germans for a while held east of Russia. So the Jews wound up being slaughtered, and during World War II, the ones living particularly in Germany and Poland. Until in all of Europe, at the beginning of the war, there were about 8 million Jews or so. By the end of the war, only about 250,000 Jews were left. The rest of them either found a way to hide, escape, or they were slaughtered. All right, pogrom. Now, I'm looking at page 377. I'm going to turn to page 378. There was a whole lot of political unrest during this time. For one thing, kings really decided finally that they could do without their knights. Their knights were more or less independent spirit, independent mind anyway, so the kings began hiring soldiers to do their fighting for them. But to hire these men, they had to get to raise taxes. Somehow, folk, and I'm not sure exactly how, a little bit of money found its way to Europe. This was been days before Columbus, before the Spanish explorers. A little bit of money found its way into Europe. And kings would then be able to raise taxes. The taxes, though, became heavier and heavier as kings had to pay their soldiers more and more. In fact, oftentimes the king simply was not able to pay their soldiers.
That's a V, not an R in the heavy, right?
What's that? H-E-A-V. Yeah, heavy taxes. And this led to peasant revolts. Now, the peasant revolts that began in the 1300s was to continue all the way until, I might say, until 1917. So you're talking about 500 or 600 years worth of revolts. At this, the initial revolts, though, were easily put down by the kings and higher nobility and resulted in very little gains for the peasants. Now, that was only temporary. Fast forward, eventually, a revolt chopped off the king's head of France, chopped off the head of the king of England. Eventually, revolt overthrew and shot dead the Tsar and his family, the Tsar of Russia, and set up a communist government. That was all to come later. The peasants gradually encroached until they fought down the nobility that had control them. Today, there's hardly a country in Europe, I mean, all these countries still have their old nobility, the Duke of this, but these viscounts, these dukes, these barons, generally have no real authority. But as recently as even 50 or 75 years ago, there still was a lot of power for the nobles in Spain and Portugal. But in recent years, even that has been taken away, to where the nobles simply do not have any power anymore. But again, that was to take hundreds and hundreds of years to bring about. The peasant revolts killed off a lot of the nobility, particularly here in northern France. The biggest uprising, though, occurred in England, where the King Richard II promised the rebels, hey, if you'll just disperse and go home, I'll give you what you want. The rebels went home with that kind of promise. Then Richard rounded up the leaders of the rebels and executed all of them, breaking his promise. All right. Because life seemed to be so short, European royal and noble houses oftentimes couldn't provide a male heir, and many, even the houses of the kings, as we're going to see, would sometimes find the king dead without a male heir to take his place. Oftentimes the heir was a child at best, and sometimes that child didn't live long enough to grow up. Europe's population that had started off doing so well in the 10, 11, and 1200s, in the 1300s declined greatly, started to rise, but then in the 1600s declined again, and only in the mid-1700s did it actually recover to where it had been in the year 1300. In 1750, the smallpox vaccination was invented. Pasteur discovered that germs cause disease, which led to sanitation, better sanitation, and the Black Death. The bubonic plague, they called it by that time. The bubonic plague disappeared from Europe. But Europe's population was to stay down, and this led to all kinds of unrest. All right. Which takes us up to the 100 Years' War. Now, the 100 Years' War is called that, yes, because it lasted 100 years. Actually, it lasted a little bit longer than that, but that doesn't mean that they were fighting constantly. There were at least 2 times during that war when there were 20-year periods of no fighting. The war was between England and France. But before I get into the details of why it happened, I want to go over something about what it did for warfare. It permanently changed warfare, in that armored knights became less and less important, and the common foot soldier became more important. At the beginning of the war, the common foot soldier and the pikemen were looked down on, and the bowmen were looked down on as being low class. The upper classes, the nobility, had suits of armor that had protected them. Well, by the end of the war, these common people were looked on with a lot more respect. A lot of armored knights fell dead at the hands of a commoner because the English particularly innovated. The English used the longbow, and a longbow could shoot several hundred yards. Of course, how many would depend on the strength of the shooter. But the longbow is about 6 foot or more long, which was quite a bit longer than the person who shot it. Most of the men of that day were shorter than the men of our day. And a longbowman could get off about 15 or 20 shots a minute. It made the crossbow obsolete. Now the crossbow, true, the crossbow could shoot at a person really, really hard, but you could only shoot at a short range of much less, maybe 100 yards, much less than a longbow could. So the crossbow became obsolete. The knight in armor became obsolete, but the pikeman. The pikeman was different from a spearman in that the spears were usually thrown, pikes were held steady, and the pikemen learned how to line up in a disciplined formation, shoulder to shoulder, in the formation, and they were the ones who protected your crossbowmen, so that when the enemy charged, the pikeman was ready there to meet even an armored knight charge, with the point of a pike. And the pikeman brought down many, many a knight in armor.